So thank you for those that lingered, and I'm super excited to be talking to you about the human psychome and longevity. And to get us started, I always like to start with meaning and substance. And this is a picture of anniversary, and this not seeing this picture that are super relevant to what we're about to hear about is that each of my grandparents were 30 years longer than their life expectancy at birth, which is a quite big difference. Yet nevertheless, both of them had really severe Alzheimer's disease. And as you can tell, I was the youngest of all of my cousins, which means that as I was getting older, my grandparents thought that they were aging in reverse. So we both believed to be children at the same time, so much so that they would call my mother their daughter as though it was their own mother. And so since I was a child, I always had this idea that there's a discriminant difference between the aging mind and the aging body. And as a result, I have never stopped asking the question of whether our mind can reverse biological aging, because that's what I thought was happening to my grandparents, which in fact was the opposite of what they were experiencing. But that question never stopped following me everywhere. So now that I live in California, this is a way that question in a different the life expectancy plotted for all individuals of all ethnic groups except Hispanics versus Hispanics. And you get to see an 8 to 9 year difference in life expectancy, which is quite robust and not at all what you would expect. Experts have since coined this discriminant phenomenon, the Hispanic paradox. I don't really like this name. I prefer to think of it as a proof of principle of something that is more substantial and perhaps a proof that biological aging can in fact be reversed with the human mind. So why do they call this a paradox? Well, for starters, Hispanics in America are some of the most societally challenged and sickest demographics we have. Hispanics are the single most uninsured and underinsured demographic, in addition to having some of the highest rates of chronic diseases, including hypertension, obesity, kidney disease, and diabetes. Nevertheless, their compromised health span does not limit their life expectancy. And in fact, not only do they live longer, but when they get serious and threatening illnesses like cancer, they get them at lower rates and they have better survival to those illnesses. Researchers that were also kind of caught by this apparent paradox decided to look a little further. Did some work and more than also look at the biological aging rate with epigenetic clocks of Hispanics and other populations. And indeed, what you see here is that Hispanics difference was even more pronounced Bolivia. And something else that I'd like to bring to your attention is the large difference between Hispanics and East Asians. We oftentimes think of these East Asian populations as an epitome of longevity. You can think of Japan and even somebody about China earlier on as really exemplars of what population longevity can look like. Yet nevertheless, we see Hispanics outperforming them in at least epigenetic aging wise. So why? Why do we have some of the sickest and most challenged people also living this longest? This challenges about everything we know about the field of aging and longevity. And while I don't have a crisp, clear answer to you yet, the leading hypothesis looks something like this. Something called the social cultural resilience model that essentially posits that it is a combination of the social network and cultural processes that Hispanics have that sort of synergize with each other to create this longevity advantage. And from the picture I showed you earlier, which is why I'll go back to it. And as you can see, my grandparents were at the center of that photograph. That in psychological terms is called allocentrism, or the opposite of being egocentric. And as a result of that, Hispanics have uncharacteristically strong and powerful social relations. They have a big sense of meaning that is derived from their religiosity, and they are always looking to support the other and lift those that are beneath them. And we start to think that it is a combination of these factors that together amount to their low rate of epigenetic aging. Now, what I just mentioned was a lot. And there is a lot of versatility and dynamism when it comes to the way in which these different traits manifest themselves even between Hispanics, but also across different populations. And that is the richness of the human psychome, which is just one of the many ohms that we study in our lab that encompasses the entire ecosystem that affects human longevity, aging, and disease. And oftentimes in clinical practice, this psychome is boiled down to mental illness, but it is so more than that. It is our thinking mind, our feeling mind. It is the people that surround us, our ability to look into the future with purpose, and our ability to look into the past with satisfaction and wisdom. So as a result, we have tried to begin to understanding how all of these ecological factors, in addition to the psychome, affect people at the individual level. So as someone brought up earlier, our lab was the first to coin this, meaning that aging has this amazing great knowledge. Ultimately, we need something else to tell us how individuals are aging. And so following this 10 years advanced multi-level data, we have been able to identify age effects that show how people vary in their aging. So you can see the person is in the leftmost screen. It's a somewhat weak ager, mostly at the kidney level, maybe a little bit more in the metabolome, whereas this person, the right, is ager at the liver, metabolic, and immune level, yet not so much. So as a result of this, we have begun to think, what if we can match this personalized precision medicine approach to aging with the robustness of the Hispanic paradox to synergize them together and effectively create what could potentially be one of the strongest anti-aging therapeutics. And it is as a result of this belief that we truly believe that having these precision mental health approaches to longevity will be one of the next frontiers that the field is missing that we hope to usher into the world. As a result of this belief, we have started conceptualizing what we want this field to be in partnership with Deep Longevity. And this is of psychology, molecular biology, to understand how each of these proteins with some of the best, including machine learning, and multi-omics, see how we can best last extension. So for the rest of the presentation, I'd just like to listen to how it works at a fundamental level and why you should even care about it. So to get us started, I was going to ask you how stressed you felt in the last couple of weeks. But I'm sure that the levels have been quite high, although maybe less so here in Dubai. Everything is so nice and pretty. And that is to lead you to see what aging can do in 4 years. So this is a picture of Obama. It's very visible that just the stress for the whole country can take us well-being. And this is at its most fundamental level what psychosomatic aging is. The process whereby our mental states accelerate our biological aging. Yet, there is something that this picture doesn't tell you. It is that this so-called presidential aging effect, some people call it the White House effect, also mirrors an paradox. Because although you may not believe it from this picture, US presidents actually outlive other men of their same life expectancy at birth. Something that we have come to believe probably comes from the fact that they're following really purposeful and duty-oriented work. And that is also what psychosomatic aging is. It is the hidden side of things, the many ways in which some of these psychological traits interact with each other in order to buffer deleterious effects and even perhaps create longer lifespans in ways that sometimes are overlooked and frankly really poorly understood. And so in order to understand how this works, first gotta point out that a lot of these psychological states and traits have been shown to affect virtually every major aging system of the body, including cognitive aging, some of the neuroplasticity that goes on in the brain. But if we look a little bit further at the molecular level, we see mental states such as depression and even optimism being linked with biomarkers like telomere attrition, mitochondrial function, senescence. All of the ones that we've mentioned before have some psychological dimension that we're now beginning to uncover across multi-omic systems. However, I also think that you kind of miss a little bit of the point by looking at a diagram that is a little bit of all-encompassing and doesn't tell you about a story or a process. So we have begun to start conceptualizing. Oh, maybe I can move this somehow. We have, maybe I'll put it like this. We have begun to start conceptualizing this psychosomatic aging so I'll take you down a little bit further so you can see exactly what we mean by that. Starting with the most fundamental backbone of it all, which is that our environment triggers us, outcomes that we will vaguely define right after. And it is this backbone in mind for the rest of the presentation, as you see it continuously coming up in different ways. So at the very fundamental level, it looks something like this, an environmental trigger that then causes you to have what we call a threat belief, which activates the stress response, and that gives the brain the power to then create a number of physiological responses that tend to not be healthy. So to give you an example of how complicated this is, because ultimately psychosomatic aging is also about the hidden side of things, I'll give you an example. Let's say that you are giving a presentation, like I am right now, and you're really so what this is going to do first and foremost is activate circuits in the brain, one in the left dorsolateral anterior and the other one in the insula that activates fear of this. Then this is going to send a signal, something called the HPA axis, also called the hypopituitary, is going to give rise to the not so popular hormone cortisol. Cortisol, amongst other things, has systemic-wide effects in the bodies, which activates the fight or flight response, so that feeling element that comes after thinking. And amongst other things, it creates inflammation through our tissues, it creates individual tissue damage, and it increases our heart rate, which prepares to meet that challenge. And of course, if this is chronically activated, then you have all kinds of outcomes. So this is that first slide I showed you, right? Psychosomatic aging at the basic level. However, there's more things that happen. As part of our stress response, our body naturally produces another hormone. It's actually a neurotransmitter called oxytocin. Naturally has antioxidant and anti-inflammatory effects. But interestingly, it makes us crave social connection and contact, right? They call it the love hormone. So that's why perhaps when you're a little stressed, your first inkling is to call somebody and make sure that you feel heard. And if you do that, and if you do that action part of the system that comes after thinking, feeling, doing, if you act on it, you end up releasing more oxytocin that doubles down on its beneficial effects, including my favorite one, which is that it is actually able to deposit itself in a niche in the outer layer of the epicardium in the heart, where it's able to activate some progenitor stem cells and literally fix some of the cardiac tissue damage that comes with the stress response, which is a very corny way and biological way of saying that love may actually be able to fix a broken heart. But however, there's also another layer to our system, which is the thinking, going back to step one. And a deeper way to look at thinking is through the effect of mindsets, which are just beliefs that are more deeply held and they bias us towards a version of reality. One of these mindsets is that stress can really screw you up. And the other mindset is it can be really helpful and it can help you surmount the energy to meet a challenge. So what happens if you have that stress is good for me mindset? Turns out it makes stress actually be good for you. It increases oxygenation and it ends up being less detrimental and less inflammatory, partially through a mechanism where people that have this mindset end up producing more of a certain kind of enzyme called catechol-ethylaminotransferase, which is a catecholamine that helps to metabolize some of the cortisol. So you titrate the amount exactly to what you need to be aroused and be focused to meet your challenge without being harmed by it. And so it isn't, but it's not a straightforward system that having a thought is really bad, but it encompasses many elements of our thinking, our deeper level of thinking, and our deeper level of feeling and acting upon these, right? And so what we have now done in our study, in our lab, is taking this principle what happens to the rest of the physium. And I'm very excited to share some of the studies, beginning with our thinking backbone. We saw in only 9 days really dramatic improvements in over 25 psychometrics, including increases in life satisfaction, hope, meaning, purpose, etc. And these things manifested at the emotional level with dramatic decreases in anxiety, depression, stress, and loneliness. And what I think will be more interesting to this crowd is that the genome gets the memo. We also saw systemic wide changes in biological improvements that I cannot give too much detail on, but suffice it to say there was thousands of changes in lipids, metabolites, immune cells, RNA transcripts, particularly something called the CTRA response, and even microbiomes in your gut. That's changed only by changing your mind. These people did not have any biological intervention. Just changing your thinking led to all of these multi-omic changes, including some that pertain to very complex behavioral pathways like addiction and reward seeking that we'll come back to in a little bit. And we're currently writing this up for a paper as well. And so I hope that from that you can see that this system of the things what we think. Of course, reinforces the whole loop, ends up being really powerful. And it's cool that we can do this in experimental trials and kind of segment it, but what does that mean for you? What does it amount to in the long term, right? And that's precisely what you should matter, because if it doesn't amount to anything in the long term, is it even worth it doing these interventions and cool studies? Well, it turns out that it does. And what we're proposing here is that it has and I think it's pertinent for everybody in the audience and online here. So I'll walk you through some of those data, what we think that the longevity payoff is quite robust. Starting with this study that I love, we talked about hierarchy of evidence earlier. This is a meta-analytic review. Meta-analysis is the highest quality data you can and from what you can see here, when it looked at all the different predictors of survival, you can see that it was support and integrate that most predictors would survive. More so than well known drinking, exercise, obesity, and others. And as I would like to highlight, which then would be congruent with what we talked about a little earlier with the study that deep longevity spearheaded, looking at the biological contribution to biological aging rates. And while Faria already did a wonderful work explaining the self-inflicted study, what we like to bring to your attention is that this and that also all the features that were used to less like logical states, things that naturally change are dynamic and can change from moment to moment, week by week. These features are more actionable and suggesting some of the biological changes. However, would not all come only with water, feel those ways. And those are our dispositions. We come into the world. Personality is one because most of personality, around 50% or so, is also psychologically ingrained. So, what about our dispositions? Do they matter? Role to play in this complex equation? And all the of a single personality trait called conscientiousness. Those are the people that are really type A, really cleaning their room, always trying to do the diligent thing. And this people turns out this basic survey, you can predict that people who are highly conscientious will have longer lives, they have lower rates of mortality. And the prediction was even larger than that of socioeconomic status. But it's a green bar. And we know that it's quite an important predictor of survival. So that says a lot, that we can get a lot just from a simple personality trait. And just to add more provocative ideas to the mix, we talked a little bit earlier about microbiome. Turns out that there's also elements of personality. One called agreeableness that predicts good microbiome health. Those are people that are very adventurous. And paradoxically, people who are highly conscientious, even though they live longer, they have worse microbial health because they're obsessed with eating the right way. And as a result, they kind of limit their dietary diversity. So yes, these dispositions do matter and they do affect how we feel and do, but through which mechanisms? The first one that I think it's a really important, like our personality, predict what we do. And that matters a lot because ultimately, everything that drives longevity, from fasting to taking a pill and being diligent about taking your pill, smoking, everything is a behavior. So ultimately, if people don't do the right things, nothing that we discovered before that matters. So the fact that you can predict behavior from a simple personality test says a lot. And I would like to also draw your attention to these 3 causes of death: suicide, alcohol abuse, and drug abuse, because these 3 are now being called the deaths in America. And that is what is now becoming one of the biggest threats to population longevity, as we're seeing this cause of death increasing, particularly amongst males who are unfortunately becoming more and more depressed. And so the fact that we have this new dimension of the aging and longevity field that looks at behavior and this behavioral causes of death gives us an upper hand that other technologies and methods that purely look at biological data cannot get to by themselves. And the other mechanism is that it's not only behavior, but also our bodies are deeply connected with our psyche. So this is just yet another example of people who are highly conscientious and or lower in neuroticism end up having totally different architecture. They end up sleeping better, go to bed earlier, and they have less sleep fragmentation, which is really important when we're talking about sleep physiology. And this is all just purely because of their personality, which, by the way, can also change and is totally, it's non-immutable. So of course, as a result of this, some of the work also at Deep Longevity has looked at some of these dispositions in combination with the traits to see if we can create biological clocks that can predict mortality or subjective age, which is in and of itself important, based on the psychological data. And indeed, it seems that the case is so. And we saw some of that work earlier. And this is really promising because not only do these psychological dimensions predict longevity independently, but they can also be indexed each other, which means that they can add something really valuable to existing aging technologies that oftentimes have ignored the psychological aspects that are quite important. So we know that dispositions like personality are independently linked to longevity, and that they can form part of this wider system. And the good thing is that it is also destiny. You can change any of the blue arrows, and you can effectively modify your aging and longevity process. So I'll end by giving you some of those data that are quite telling. Starting again only with the highest quality of data, a randomized control trial that was conducted at Stanford in 1999 by David Spiegel, who I used to actually work with. He's like, women, and they were doing group therapy or randomized. And as you can see from this graph, there was a drastic difference of almost 18 months longer survival of the women who did the psychotherapy. I mean, that is more than what most adjacent or adjuvant cancer therapies can achieve. And this was just a psychological intervention that led to 18 months longer survival in the highest and most controlled of settings, which says quite a lot. And to be fair, studies that have tried to replicate this have found mixed feelings. And this is what we believe, that a precision medicine approach guided by big data is best to approach this kind of phenomenon, because those studies have demonstrated that it is men and people who are lonely that will strongly benefit from these psychological interventions, and that different people will benefit differently from different psychological interventions. So the big data and personalization aspect of it are essential. And while I cannot give a lot of detail, I will also say that based on the data earlier, we may have reason to believe that psychological interventions may also reverse biological aging at the molecular level, only by changing your mind. And while I cannot say more than that because it is unpublished data, stay tuned for a publication coming from the Snyder Lab soon. We're really excited about those results. And while I think this says a lot about what you should care about curating a mind that is adaptive to aging and longevity, I think that there is a more purposeful and bigger reason why you should care about the psychosomatic aging approach. And it is because ultimately longevity is not an end, it is a means to an end. And I think in this longevity conferences and settings, people totally miss the point. Because if I were to tell you that you could live forever, but you would be the only person on the planet, nobody would take that, because it is other people that give meaning to our life. And interestingly, the Hispanic paradox teaches us just that by following the orientation of others and purpose and meaning and connecting deeply, we can live longer. And I think that the real paradox is that we're expecting that by living longer, we'll suddenly be happier without actually doing the right things. And that's why I think psychosomatic aging is totally novel and an important contribution to the aging field at large, because it not only asks the question, how can we add more years to life? But it also asks the question, how can we add more life to years? And that is an invaluable contribution that I hope gets embedded into the aging field at large. And with that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you, everybody. And of course, thank you to, we'll get there, our collaborators, Deep Longevity, UCLA School of Medicine, and my PIs and mentors, Michael Snyder and Ariel Gans, and the entire team at Stanford Center for Genomics and Precision Medicine. So thank you, everybody. I'll take questions if there's any.